Hi, this is Eric from Bay Area Hang Gliding, reading another ground school article. This is Thermal Lore, Part 6, Looking for Patterns by Dennis Pagen. I just randomly started on this one because it was on top. It was a series in the magazine, a great series. I think it's like 20 years ago. It taught me a lot. And yeah, I'll definitely read the other ones. These are very important articles if you want to be a soaring pilot, thermal soaring pilot. One characteristic of the human mind is the ability to recognize patterns. It is pattern recognition that allows us to read the printed page, to recognize friends in a crowd, or to see a viper hidden in the grass. Perhaps the epitome of patterns recognition was displayed by the codebreakers of World War II, or by the brilliant French scholar Jean-Francois Champollion when he deciphered the Rosetta Stone and translated Egyptian hieroglyphs. But we don't need to be decoders or brilliant to use our pattern recognition abilities in our world of flight. Most of us use pattern recall to help us find lift and deny gravity for prolonged pleasure. When you go to a house thermal area and hit old reliable, you are recognizing a pattern. When you go to a good-looking cloud, you are recognizing a pattern. When you tighten up a 360 to use a small swatch of lift, when you are recognizing a pattern. When your significant other expects to see you pacing the floor the moment cumulus clouds start sailing, that person is recognizing a pattern. Patterns in the air can be in both space and in time. If we go to expected thermal generation sources, we're exploiting spatial space patterns. If we plan to launch in the maximum heat of the day, we are relying on temporal or time patterns. Both types of patterns can be simple or complex. No matter what the nature of the pattern, it is almost always sure that the pilot who best recognizing patterns in the near atmosphere will be the one who excels. So this month we will concentrate on patterns as they relate to thermal excellence. Our first concern will be small-scale patterns, the paisley prints in the sky. Thermals themselves are the patterns we are talking about. Here is a list of items to look for in a thermal, which have various degrees of reliable repetition. The size, the strength, the longevity, the height, the movement, the cohesiveness, mutal tempetus, the timing. Thermal size can vary greatly on a given day if the areas of heating are varied on the ground. However, on most days there is a similarity to the size of the cores and thus how big you should make your circle for best efficiency. The terrain is as much a factor here as the nature of the day's conditions. For example, in Florida, the thermals all tend to be much wider and gentler than, say, in the Owens Valley. Learn to recognize the thermal size quickly and expect others to be similar on a given day. On the other hand, in all cases, be ready to expect the unexpected and wrap up tightly in the occasional shots of 1,000 feet per minute that even Florida has to offer. Great pilots have good models in their data banks, but they also have the ability to quickly switch paradigms when necessary. Strength. The strength of a thermal depends on the excess heat and the lapse rate of the air, as we have seen in previous parts of the series. Generally, you should expect a pattern of similar thermal strength within a period of an hour. Of course, you should expect the strength to quickly increase once trigger temperatures, the temperatures for thermals to bust through the ground inversion, is reached. Then you should expect a gradual increase in strength as the day heats, followed by a gradual diminishment as the solar heating wanes. Such a pattern is a temporal pattern. It behooves us to understand it well to excel. Longevity. The length of time that a thermal feeds is surprisingly consistent on a given day in a given area. I find that if one thermal feeds long enough to yield a 3,000-foot climb, most others in the day will do the same. If only brief climbs are available, don't expect to find a stairway to heaven. In that case, I switch into semi-survival mode or full-blown Rambo ramp-up, depending on how low I'm running or how badly I want to stay airborne. Height. We all recognize the max height of a thermal as a fairly reliable pattern on a given day. Either cloud-based, inversions, or thermal strength determine this characteristic. Of course, we should all be ready to exploit the rogue thermal that plows upward with unexpected vigor. Movement. Thermals move around depending on the wind flows at different levels, the nature of the lapse rate, or even the terrain. The pilot who quickly recognizes the shifty nature of such lift will move more readily to top out. If one thermal is shifty, expect the rest to be. Cohesiveness. Thermal cohesiveness refers to the nature of the core. Is the core singular or multiple? Thermals with multiple cores are generally part of a pattern of the day. Again, having lots of flying buddies with you is the best way to detect such a thermal nature. When one thermal is multi-hearted, I look for the others to be as well. In that case, extra attention to being in the best core is imperative to success. Mutal impetus. Mutal impetus is a Latin word I made up to keep you on your toes. It means the change, muta, with height, alta, and the force, impetus. Thermals don't often maintain the same strength throughout the entire height of their climb. On a given day, the lapse rate and heating determine this factor. Learn the nature of the thermal passage in your first few thermals, and you'll be able to best exploit the maximum lift, or know when to shift gears as you get lower. Oh, no wonder I didn't recognize that word. Muta alta impetus. Okay. Thermal timing. Thermal timing refers to how often a given thermal generation area, field, rock pile, parking lot, and so on, releases a thermal pulse. You can start this timing at the launch area and modify it as you get experience throughout the day. This factor depends on the terrain, of course, but also on the day's heating. It is also tied up with the length of the thermals and the amount of wind. When wind quickly evacuates an area, okay, should have had a better article. Thermal lengths will be shorter. The release will be more frequent and less brought down from aloft. Sorry about that. Areas with a large supply of warm air at the surface may pulsate with the wind effects, but release thermals every few minutes. Cooler areas in post-cold front conditions may result in a thermal release timed a half hour or more apart. In all cases described above, there is an upside and a downside to pattern recognition. The upside is that you have the same thing to rely on to put into your bag of tricks. If thermals were completely random on a given day, you would be doing a lot less relaxing in the air and perhaps be less adept at staying up on pure heat energy. With semi-reliable regularity of the lift, we can often pass by anemic lift and go for the gusto of a fierce thermal. The downside is that sometimes we have to settle for the thermal dregs when we know that there's gold in them there hills. Life isn't often fair, but it is usually interesting if you set your sights high enough. I can't even read that. Say bold plaids. The next level on which to seek pattern is on a scale from a few miles to tens of miles. This is the bold plaid pattern of the firmament. We'll put this category such things as thermal spacing, cloud suck, lift patches, convergence lines, thunderstorms, waves, undifferentiated terrain, cloud streets, and textured terrain. So, thermal spacing is the distance between thermals shows a notable regularity on a given day. The spacing has been found to be greatly dependent on the height of the maximum lift. Typically, the thermals will be distributed with a spacing of about 4 times their height. So if they reach to 5,000 feet above ground, they will be about 4 miles apart. So 5,000 is about a mile, so 4 times 4 a mile. If they each reach 15,000 feet, expect the thermals to be spread around to 10 to 12 miles apart. The actual distance also depends on the terrain, of course, so we can always have to note the local conditions. The important point is to recognize the potential patterns in the spacing and judge accordingly. Cloud suck. Cloud suck occurs when the thermal lift feeding a cloud accelerates as it gets a few hundred feet from the base of the cloud. The presence of cloud suck depends on the condition of the air near the cloud base, moisture content, and lapse rate, among other things. So on a given day when you experience cloud suck, expect other clouds to be vacuuming equally. In a later installment, we will go into detail about cloud suck, including prediction and procedures. Number 3, lift patches. In some of the studies referred to in earlier articles in this series, it was made clear that what we think of a thermal is actually a small portion of the potential lifting area. Many times, most of us have felt multiple lifting areas around one or two stronger central cores. Most likely in moisture areas, thermals are a family affair. In other words, they are ganged together in an area of general lift, as shown in Figure 1. Convergence lines. For the purposes of our slow little craft, we think of the one spot lifting best. But in most cases, an accurate model would be of multiple thermals or multiple cores, all rising from the same general area. These lifting areas can be spread over the land in regular patterns, in regular undifferentiated terrain, see below, or erratically positioned according to the landforms. It is in our best interest to recognize the existence of these patterns and try to establish if they are regular or not. If so, how far apart are they? If not, what terrain features give rise to them? I know that certain areas in my home sites, as well as at other sites I fly around the world, exhibit regular patterns of lift production in large areas with draining sink everywhere else. I think that figure is really worth showing. It's pretty small. It's showing some convergence lines. Those of us who can run XC seminars preach the necessity to spend as much effort perfecting glide skills as thermaling skills. One thing patently clear to all of us in competition is that there are patterns in the non-lifting area of the sky as well as in the thermals. The cause of these lift and sink lines, as we call them, has not been studied scientifically, as far as I know, but it is easy to speculate that in wind, the sinking air caused by a thermal can be elongated just like the lift. However, sink and lift lines appear to be strung out so long that I am not convinced that this is the sole cause. A few years ago I had an observation that I think may be more pertinent. I have a large yard on a slope which is ideal for launch practice with hang gliders and paragliders. It faces the cold northwest wind. On a winter day with solid snow cover on a stiff breeze, I was standing outside watching the snow blow when I noticed that the snow was piled up in continuous multiple parallel ridges aligned with the wind flow. I got to thinking how water gives us so many good models of airflow, waves, rotor turbulence, so why not blowing snow? I could see that one little imperfection started a local pileup that would alter the airflow downwind and beside it. The downwind side of this bulge slowed the wind, and snow filled in behind it. Beside it, the snow was excavated because the displaced wind sped up, converged. Before long, a ridge of snow was paralleled by a trough on both sides. But it didn't stop there, for the altered flow near the bulge and trough system caused another ridge on the other side of the troughs, and the process continued to grow. It could affect a local change that propagated by creating an artificial hump in the snow. These snow lines extended for 10 to 50 yards. Figure 2 illustrates the process I saw. The air developed parallel lines of convergence and divergence. The lifting area in the air is over the trough in the snow. The sink is over the snow ridge. Okay, so that was the number 2 I showed you earlier. I thought you referenced that. Thunderstorms. Thunderstorms tend to build up in very moist and unstable conditions. They are often caused by fronts plowing through an area of upper air disturbances. However, some thunderstorms form over local hotspots and follow a pattern of placement during thunderstorm conditions. It is important for safety reasons to recognize and avoid potential thunderstorm patterns. These patterns are especially prevalent in high mountain areas and islands where extra lift help the thunderstorm develop. Waves. Waves that we can use are all generated by wind flowing over mountains, hills, or ridges in certain atmospheric conditions. They often occur at the end of a thermal day in the post-cold front periods in the eastern USA. I have been in waves a number of times, but they tend to be hard to predict. So they are simply a joy to revel in when they appear, just like love. On the other hand, waves tend to affect the wind and lift patterns below them, so any signs of waves, lenticular clouds, or varying wind strength on the ground should make us aware that lift patterns may be present in areas perpendicular to the wind flow. Undifferentiated terrain. Undifferentiated terrain means a surface that is little changed in cover or contour over a wide area. The classic undifferentiated surface is water. More common to our thermal experience is desert or grassy plains with similar ground cover spread expansively. In such cases, thermals arise in quite regular patterns. In little or no wind, this pattern will be more or less hexagonal honeycomb cells with lift in the middle and sink in the intersections as cells. Figure 3 shows such a pattern as given by a study in Australia and detection of lift at sea. This pattern is the most energy efficient for a turnover of the heated surface area. When there is a wind, the cells tend to tilt over until they turn into regular lines of cloud streets, similar to the lifting line discussed previously. Figure 4. There's the figure 3. Cloud streets. Cloud streets are extremely prevalent, even without clouds, in which case they are known as blue streets, and should be expected any time the wind is over 8 miles per hour on the surface in greener areas. In the desert areas, the high thermals and lack of any lid on the lift is not conducive to streets. Streets complicate matters when you are traveling crosswind, but when going parallel to the wind, they are a boon, as long as you expect the street pattern and find the line. So obviously in the hexagon pattern, you can see different ways the clouds would line up. Textured terrain. Textured terrain is what most of us fly over. This means we navigate above humps and bumps as high as Mount Whitney and as low as the Florida Ridge. Most of us are aware that the high ground tends to trigger and collect thermals. It is these areas where we should seek to do our business. I live in the Eastern Ridge and Valley system and have ample experience bearing this rule out. Even when there is no ridge lift due to light wind or crossing wind, the ridge is the place to be to find thermals. We have experimented with going into the valley and usually found nothing, unless a particular land feature says, try here. The high ground sets the pattern for lift all around it. The higher it is, the greater this pattern extends. I expect a hill or a mountain gathers lift from at least 10 times its height or more, and thus shuts down thermals in that area, except for on its flanks. Remember this pattern the next time you need a thermal friend. As with the smaller scale patterns, these wide scale patterns all have exceptions to the rule. But an awareness that they exist and using them as much as possible is the magic that yields great flights. The final patterns we'll explore are the ones that most people know as weather. They occur over hundreds of miles and can be listed as 1. Prefrontal conditions, 2. Postfrontal conditions, 3. Highs and lows, 4. Jet stream. Prefrontal conditions. Since we rarely fly during frontal passage, the pattern of conditions within the front itself is only of interest to us as weather wonks. But those pilots who live where fronts pass as regularly as the mailman should know what patterns prevail immediately before and after the front. Before a cold front, the east typically experiences winds from the eastern to southern quarter. Even though the sky can be overcast, good thermals frequently are abundant because the whole air mass is unstable. It is being lifted by the frontal progress. Postfrontal conditions. Before a warm front, west to southwest winds are typical, with stable air being the norm, especially if the high cirrus and stratus that precedes these fronts are present. Sometimes, however, a day before the front strikes, winds can be blustery and humidity can accumulate so that convection leading to a thunderstorm can develop. If conditions aren't too strong and thunderstorms aren't embedded in the haze, flying will be reasonable. The point is to recognize the approach of the different fronts, use a weather service, and know what to expect by learning the pattern associated with slow and fast cold and warm fronts. Highs and lows. After the passage of a cold front, we most often see the combination of a good wind aloft and good thermal production that leaves the east in the throes of XC fever. Typically, the good lapse rate and the winds last from 1 to 3 days after the front pushes through. Then high pressure moves in to stabilize the sky and sends us back to the drudge routine of work. When a warm front passes, the air warms up. What did you expect? The air often stabilizes and gets more hazy. When a high behind the warm front arrives in an area, you may as well mow the lawn or sit by the pool sipping Singapore slings. True flying is dead. Knowing the nature of this weather pattern is what can save you pointless trips to the hill only to set up forlornly, sled rides down the incline of air to the landing field, and sit around kicking rocks after a sweaty fold-up. I don't mind a sled ride. Jet stream. Finally, we mentioned the jet stream as a key to the weather and wind in an area. When the jet stream drops down as a gift from our Canadian neighbors, invariably a low pressure forms and a cold front follows. When the jet stream loops north, fair weather is in the offing. But if a warm front high squats over the area, leave the thermal underwear at home. You're not getting high, except with the aid of a propeller. The jet stream presence also tends to cause higher winds at the surface. Spend some time using the weather services on the web and follow the position of the jet stream to see how it affects your surface winds. With a little practice, you can learn to predict the jet stream position and the flying effects. Such large-scale pattern recognition is a great help in figuring out the atmosphere that buoys us up. It should be clear from this little discussion that there is much to observe in the fluid in which we choose to immerse ourselves. It repeats itself like a TV preacher trying to fatten the collection plate. There are patterns of all sizes with varying degrees of reliability. Most of them are more dependent than many pilots think. Forming a working model of the different patterns that occur in our little universe will make you a better pilot. Guaranteed. The more accurate the model, the more ironclad is the guarantee. Of course, such pattern recognition takes some time to internalize and utilize, but getting there is half the fun. Hopefully, this article will help jumpstart the process and give you a solid basis with which to form your own pattern databank. Seeing the true colors of the sky in your mind map is the path to fulfillment and fun in the air. Safety, I'll add myself. Okay, they have some little plug for some person if anyone wants to read it. I'm not going to read that out loud. Some ads from the old magazine this is printed from. There's the date, 2003. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, everyone.